So today I'm starting this, unsure what I'm even going to title it, which I don't think has happened in a while. Tentatively, I've named it On Editing, but I really don't know if that'll survive. I have a bunch of thoughts. I'm not sure they cohere that well. And the funny thing is that this might be about editing, but it probably needed more editing before I began it. What I was struck by this morning while I was listening to the news is it seems as though everybody in the world really, really wants a strongman to lead them. Now, this started a while back. This started in Russia, and it started with Vladimir Putin. And Putin became powerful because after the fall of the Soviet Union, and after kind of the dust settled for a few years, it seemed as though the people who were very wealthy concentrated all the power to themselves, but there was a lot of lawlessness, there was a lot of economic uncertainty, there were a lot of people who could not find steady work, could not provide for their needs. And so what people really wanted, they would give away a whole lot of good governance. They would give away a whole lot of openness in their institutions and freedom to dissent if someone would come along who was just willing to cut through everything and impose order. And that's what Vladimir Putin did. And he has continued to gather power to himself. He continues, I haven't checked lately, but as far as I know, he is still very, very popular in Russia, despite the fact that he has in many ways stifled dissent and retaliated against people who oppose him in very violent ways. And so he has set himself up foursquare against the idea that someone can disagree with you but not be your enemy. He has more or less made it plain that if you disagree with him, and you do it publicly, you are his enemy, and he is very powerful, and he will use all forms of that power to stop you pointing out your disagreements with him. And that worries me. We've been through a whole lot of chapters in human history where we tried to live that way, with our leaders imposing order in exactly that way, and they have all built to these nightmarish crescendos where they got toppled, and we had to start over and try it again. Now, you start with Putin. Then you have Donald Trump. Now you have the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, and I am recording this the day that the election results are in. He's been the prime minister, I think, since 2013, and then he became the president and head of state not long after that. And there was a nationwide referendum that completely reconfigured the government to give him a whole lot of power and to take the term limits off. And then, of course, there's Hugo Chavez down in Venezuela. And Hugo Chavez was a different kind of strongman. He was very heavy-handed, he was very powerful, and he took violent swipes at his enemies. But it's best to keep in mind that my political sympathies, they tend to the left, and Chavez was very much a leftist. Was he a flawed leftist? Was he a non-representative leftist? You could make that argument, but there are people who are on the political right wing who could say that Donald Trump is a distortion, and there are a lot who do. And the left-right, it's shorthand, and it's a shortcut, and it's corner cutting, and we use it, and I'm in the habit of using it, but it's a flawed way to line up where people position themselves relative to one another in politics anyway. And really, that should be an episode of its own at some point. There's Putin, there's Trump, there's Erdogan, there was Chavez before he passed away, and there have been others as well. There's Duterte in the Philippines. This wish for someone who will impose order and the willingness to give away the openness of your institutions if you will just feel safe. The willingness to live as though you were on a lifeboat after a ship has sunk, and there is someone who is the captain of the lifeboat who has taken charge in the conditions of emergency. That is not something that is limited to the United States. That's something that seems to be happening in multiple parts of the globe, in countries that are so very different culturally, but they're all feeling the resonance of this wish, this craving for order, and this willingness to follow whoever will impose it. And then, with my wandering thoughts, it being Monday morning and all, that got me to thinking about TV commercials for prescription medication, which I keep hearing is something that pretty much only happens in the United States. And visitors from other countries come here and they turn on the television and they see ads for prescription drugs, and they find that completely bizarre. And what it culminates in is people going to the doctor and saying, I want you to prescribe me this medication because I saw the ad for it and the people were smiling and playing frisbee on the beach, and I want to be able to smile and play frisbee on the beach, so prescribe me this medication. And I think that there are people who will also, they will follow after homeopathic remedies. And they will try to do the homeopathic thing and the naturopath thing. And I eat food that has no chemicals in it, even though all food is chemicals. Your body is made of chemicals. Because what people do is they form a picture in their mind of what they think will satisfy them, and the degree to which that picture comes out of any kind of rational process is really, really very marginal. It's really very driven by a craving for comfort and a shying away from doing the very hard work of thinking skeptically and scrutinizing what it is they have set up as their objective. A couple of times in a couple of classes this term, I have talked with my students about motivated cognition, about the difference between accuracy goals and directional goals. So accuracy goals, that refers to when you set about gathering information on a topic, and what you want to know is you want to know what the right answer is, and you really don't have any sort of stake in any particular answer being the right one. So the example that I got out of the literature where I first encountered this concept was, if you go out shopping for a washing machine, you might not know much about washing machines. So you look into a bunch of them, and you look into what do they cost, you look into how well do they hold up. You want the most accurate picture of what's a well-made washing machine for a price that I can afford, and you don't have any particular loyalty to any brand of washing machine. Your goal at that point would be accuracy. And so you would accept, if you found a bad review on a particular brand, you would incorporate that, and you would lower the possibility, lower the likelihood that you would go with that brand. But we don't always, when we collect information, have accuracy goals. Sometimes we have directional goals. Directional goals, what that refers to is you go collecting information, but you already somewhere in mind, you have the outcome you want chosen. And so you will cherry pick the facts that support the answer that you want. And you will downplay the facts that complicate or disturb the outcome that you want. A whole lot of people who really, really love dogs, they will walk up to any dog that they see out in public, including a dog whose owner says, she really doesn't like strangers, maybe you ought to keep back. And they will say, oh, but I love dogs, and look, she's happy to see me, she's friendly. And they're not really looking at all the cues that the dog is giving off. They're looking for any cues that might suggest that the dog really likes them. So they might see tail movement, say, look, her tail is wagging. No, her tail is clenching up to herself because she's terrified. And that would be an example of motivated cognition, of having a directional goal and framing what you see so that it confirms what you want to see. There's also, of course, the example that sometimes when we're attracted to someone, and we are hoping that we can make some kind of progress in a romantic relationship, we will look and we will interpret their cues as adding up to they're attracted to us as well. And if you have an accuracy goal, then you watch carefully for signs that they are being polite, that they are letting you down easy. But if you have a directional goal, then anything you see, you can twist into a clue that they really, really are attracted to you. And the thing that I am left with when I see so much motivated cognition, so many people in their reasoning, they downplay what they don't want to see. You know, the world does not end when we're wrong. The world does not end when we have to keep on looking. If I get excited about a particular washing machine, but then I run across a string of bad reviews and I realize this is probably poorly designed and is probably not a wise purchase, in other words, I need to keep looking. If I get attracted to a person and I think this is a romantic relationship and it turns out that person's not attracted to me and I was wrong and I have to keep on looking, the world doesn't end. But somehow, so many people, and people as collectives, people as groups, have so little tolerance for setbacks, so little tolerance for delays or frustration or uncertainty. It's attributed to P.T. Barnum that he said that there's a sucker born every minute. And it seems to me like the miracle is that we ever have even a single good thought. And it occurred to me that the good thoughts that we do have, those are the ones that pass the test of time. Those are the ones that we cling to because they give us some basis for optimism. But all the really terrible thoughts, I'm old enough to remember a fad for pet rocks. Those all get washed out of memory. And so I think we have this false notion that a lot of our thinking is actually very high quality, when I think that the overwhelming majority of the decisions that we arrive at are probably mediocre or below. And over the weekend, I stumbled while rummaging around, puttering around on my computer. I stumbled across a speech given, I think it was last fall sometime in 2016, I believe, by a writer by the name of Kelly Corrigan, and the name of her talk was The Power of Acceptance. And she made an argument that I've bumped into before, but she did a pretty good job on it. She said, people are drawn to storytelling, but there is a downside to storytelling. The more we shoehorn reality into the shape of a story, the more we blind ourselves and the more we set ourselves up to be blindsided. I mean, how many times just in the past few years have you heard someone say, you couldn't make this up? If you tried to write this as a screenplay, you'd be laughed out of Hollywood. Well, that's because stories, to be good consumer products, they have to, in some sense, fit a shape to where you go along for the ride on the story and you experience emotions and you experience revelations in a sequence that is in some sense pleasing. Now, it could be pleasing in the sense of being terrifying. It could be pleasing in the sense of being a tearjerker. They don't all have to be happy and goofy. But in some way, it has to be satisfying. And the thing about reality is not always satisfying. And I think that goes straight back to people's craving for a strongman, because what they want in their leaders is they want something satisfying, and what they don't want is the unsatisfying messiness and incompleteness of reality. But when you choose your leaders, who you will follow, what the rules will be by which you come together as a community, when you are driven in that job by trying to craft a story instead of by trying to channel and constrain reality, when you're driven by storytelling and not by managing the conditions around you, then this distortion, this blindness, this is the source of a lot of what I am seeing that I am struggling with. So I remember a number of years back, I don't remember who said it actually, I think it was in an interview, and actually maybe I do remember who said it, but I remember a line that stuck with me, and it was two people in a romantic relationship talking to one another. One of them was doing the interview, and the other one, just as a quick little one-off line, said, "Oh, that's okay, edit me to fit your theory." And that line stuck with me, and a few years later, I had a family member of my marriage who was sort of working a little bit at a time on becoming a counselor, and a few times, and this is kind of a bad habit of this particular person, this person tried to explain me to me. This person tried to identify the thinking errors I was making, and honestly, this person was very early in this process of learning to be a counselor, and so that identifying my thinking errors was a little bit crude, and these are things I've studied before, and I finally let it come out of my mouth one day. I said, no, that's fine, edit me to fit your theory. And we live in a Photoshop world. We live where editing is so available to us, and in particular, it's very hard to tell whether there is such a thing as reality anymore. I remember when Photoshop first started to become as powerful a tool as it is, and how many people were really rather alarmed, and in retrospect, maybe rightly so, that for so long, photos were fairly reliable evidence that something genuinely had happened. Because when you tampered with photos, you did so with fairly crude tools. You did so with X-Acto knives. And there would be sharp lines or inconsistencies that people could spot. And trying to erase absolutely all of those imperfections bordered on impossible. But in Photoshop, it borders on trivial. anyone who's really good with Photoshop can make a really, really convincing photo of something that never, ever, ever happened. And it winds up, I think, we have a background reality that was created, and we can't tell the created background reality from a background reality that we walked into but had no control over. And so I think because we are exposed to so many images, we are plunged into so many realities that are edited, we assume that the world is consistent. We assume that people's feelings are consistent, not ambivalent. We see people say things, do things, apparently choose things, and we land upon a simple emotion that we think they must be feeling, even though we know, all of us in our own inner life, how often we feel ambivalent, how often we feel multiple mixed emotions at once or confused about what we're feeling at all. But we edit other people into being perfectly consistent. We think that we have complex inner lives, but other people do not. And the thing that I believe, and I believe this more firmly, I think, than I believe just about anything, is, well, that may be an exaggeration. That's actually a pretty huge hyperbole. But something that I am absolutely positive is true is that the world is not linear. And history is not linear. History happens in fits and starts. Things happen that it's not possible for us to explain. Now, my faith teaches me that the creator of the universe is in control in it all, and that the creator of the universe is redeeming all things and repurposing all things to fit into a plan. But when we try to impose narrative tidiness, when we try to streamline, what we are doing is we are downplaying complexity. Donald Trump, through the TV show The Apprentice, what he did is he attracted a whole lot of eyeballs to a whole lot of television sets where he played the role of being the one who was completely in control. And all of these celebrities, all of these figures who were the condensation of our ideas about power, about fame, about wealth, all of these celebrities spoke deferentially to him. And he pulled all the strings, and a whole lot of viewers got that image of him wedged in their minds. And so now, when the media reports on decisions that he makes, when the media reports on things he does that he himself criticized only a few months ago, that he called reason to be locked up, but now he's doing them himself, and his followers have absolutely no reason to see any inconsistency there, because the one feature of their reality that they have staked themselves to is that he is a strong man, that others defer to him, that he defines the rules of the game. And if it seems as though his behavior is inconsistent, it must be that whoever has claimed that it's inconsistent simply doesn't understand the game. And so that mental editing process happens. That motivated cognition, that directional reasoning happens. If you've ever had reporters show up and cover something that happened in your neighborhood, if you have ever been interviewed and been on the local news, or maybe even the national news, then you know how possible it is, how common it is for journalists to get details absolutely wrong, for them to try to explain to their viewers what's happening, and for them to get details wrong all over the place. They speak about accuracy. I think in their hearts they value accuracy. I think in my heart I value a lot of things I aspire to, but I know I fall very, very short of them. And I know I get through every day managing because I'm trying to reach short-term objectives for my own upkeep and my own well-being. And I know that what journalists are really out to do, and I'm going to get into a cooking analogy that you may get tired of, is they are taking what happened and they are cooking it down to a narrative that is digestible. to a narrative that's not going to give anyone an upset stomach, to a narrative that nobody is going to vomit up, that nobody is going to swallow and choke on because it wasn't chewed enough. The more digestible that narrative is, and along the way, the more tasty it is, the more of a sharp flavor they can give to it, the more money they're going to make. And yes, in a perfect world, they would be accurate. But all of us in our workplaces, if we were all paragons of honesty, absolutely impeccable, kind and upright and righteous in every single one of our dealings, yes, the world would be a better place. And yes, we aspire to that, and we aim ourselves at that, and we beat ourselves up when we don't reach that. But we also know that we don't reach that. And I think anybody who takes the mental shortcut of assuming a reporter said it, so it must be true, a reporter said it, so it must be accurate, at the very least they were trying to be accurate, well, no, they wish they could be accurate, and their conscience tells them that they should be accurate, but the first objective is that they weave it into a story that when people consume the story, they will be satisfied. And therein lies the problem. And we, because we live in the third or fourth wave of the mass media age, because we started out, centuries before us, there were newspapers, then there was radio news, then there and along the way newsreels, then there was television news, and it became 24-hour television news, and now we are bombarded by a fire hose of information, and journalistic organizations trying to stay alive, and other organizations that have an ideological agenda trying to gather power to themselves, and individuals blogging and tweeting, and all of that information just buffeting us in this riptide of information. We are being fed so many narratives, all of them, by the way, cooked down to make them digestible and to give them different flavors. So you've got the choice of a whole lot of accounts of reality, each one prepared differently, each one drawing from the same material world, but flavoring it differently. So you find yourself, it's almost like being in a frozen yogurt shop where there are 2 zillion taps. And you can get paralyzed by choice, or you can find a couple of choices that comfort you. But what is happening if you take about 3 giant steps back from this whole mediated buffer between us and reality is we are losing the enzymes that we need to digest reality. What would happen if civilization were to collapse tomorrow and you no longer got your news of the world from a computer or from a television? Instead, it was just what was in front of you, the limited amount of information, what your senses brought you. I don't think we could handle it. I think that anyone brought up in this world would absolutely proceed as though things were predictable, as though things were consistent. And the world is not that way. Things happen that we did not see coming. Things happen and they do not make sense. I think I mentioned this in a past episode, but I remember hearing someone talk, I believe it was in a podcast, it might have been on the Hidden Brain podcast, but a particular study of people who, by their poor driving, had struck someone else and killed them. And then the second group in this study was people who had struck and killed someone in a way that was not preventable. That was just a freak accident. And honestly, there was more severe psychological damage when there was nothing that could have been done to prevent it. Because when you knew you were at fault, at least the universe had some cause and effect to it. At least you could put your finger down on what had caused it and you could understand it. But when you had been going about your routine and doing everything right, and someone just distracted stepped out into traffic and you hit them and killed them, then the world is a random place. And that's something we shy away from in horror. We are equipped with so much knowledge and to be given so much raw material that we are taught from childhood that we should be able to turn into good decisions, and to realize all the information in the world can't erase the fact that the world is not complete and that the world is chaotic. Where I get to at the end of this is I think, what could bring about a reframing? What would it take for followers of Donald Trump to see clearly what he's doing? To see that the exact things that he called out President Obama for, he insulted President Obama for going out golfing too often, and now he goes out golfing every single weekend. What would it take for his followers to understand that that's hypocrisy? And I get just boiling over with frustration, wondering, what does it take? But I reached a point where I had to turn that around, where I had to get to the mirror image of that thought. And I had asked myself, why did it take so much for me to stop fiddling while Rome burned? Why, for so many years, did I see that there were these dislocations, economic dislocations, social dislocations, the appearance that we had all reached a consensus about how to understand race, about how to understand people's choices surrounding sex, when actually there was no consensus at all. There was an enforced silence, a lot of arm twisting. So when Donald Trump came on the scene and started to talk about political correctness, and I rolled my eyes because I remembered political correctness being the whipping child back in the 1990s, and I thought that was tired and worn out. I was the one who was in denial. And I did not realize how much frustration that had been driven into the shadows, that had been driven into invisibility, that had been marginalized, had continued to ferment. Because I had taken the world that I thought was appropriate, and I had selected details, and I had cherry-picked information, and I had edited the world I was actually living in until I became blind to the forces that were distorting it. So this, I think, has been some healthy thinking, because what I started doing last November is my entire diagnosis. It all focused on them. It was, what is wrong with them? How could they do this? How can I live in the same community as people who think this way? But this has been one of the first times that I can see very clearly what I think is unhelpful thinking, unproductive thinking, destructive thinking in the group that I don't identify with. And then I can turn it around and I can see, not only have I done exactly the same kind of thinking, but I haven't done it for, at this point, 5 months, and you can add on the election cycle as well, I guess, but I've done it for almost a whole generation. I've done it for pretty much my entire adult life. And why am I surprised after a period like that? Why am I surprised after so much time of thinking in a way that smoothed over, that erased things to which I should have been paying attention, that eventually those could no longer be covered? Those eventually had the corrosive force that made them demand my attention. So coming back to, what am I supposed to call this? Is this about editing? Is this about coherence? Is this about willful blindness? I guess I go back to my faith, and one of my favorite passages out of the Bible from 1 Corinthians 13 says, "We know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will come to an end." And some of the parts of the Bible that comfort me the most, another one is Deuteronomy 29:29. "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children, that we may obey all the words of this law." The Bible reassures me in a number of places. I don't know it all. I don't have to know it all. It is all known by the one who is the creator of the universe, who redeems everything that happens and works it all into his plan. I've been listening lately to a lot of the podcast sermons of a guy by the name of Matt Chandler, and he says that when God works out his plan, you can pretty much rely on the fact it's not going to look like what we expected. And I think that's because one of our limitations as flawed humans, as fallen humans who are separated from the one who knew everything and was willing to guide us through everything, is all of us have this tendency of motivated cognition and directional goals. And all of us are going to frame what we perceive with the motivation of pretending that we live in the world that we wish we did live in. That tips us in the direction of our selfish goals. And I do that, and other people do that. And when we get too proud of our education and the quality of our thinking, that's what brings about landslides and tectonic shifts like we saw in the last election cycle. And I think if I can figure out what to do constructively about this, that's kind of a big deal.